This is the story of fighter jets, machines that evolved from fragile prototypes into the deadliest predators of the sky. But who started this race? Who led each generation? And as we look toward the future, will pilots even exist inside the cockpit? From Germany's Me-262, the very first jet fighter in World War II, to America's F-22 Raptor, the stealth master of the skies, and to China's secretive J-50 project, every generation brought new breakthroughs, shocking price tags, and bitter rivalries. The cost began at just a few $100,000 per aircraft in the 1940s, but now a single sixth-generation fighter is projected to cost over $300 million in. Each generation tells us a story. Who built it first, how much it cost, and how it changed the face of war. Stay with us as we journey through the 6 generations of fighter jets, a tale of innovation, rivalry, and billions of dollars spent to rule the skies. First generation, the dawn of the jet age, 1940s, 1950s. The Second World War was reaching its brutal peak when Germany unveiled something the world had never seen before. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. Powered by twin turbojet engines, the Me-262 could outrun any Allied fighter. It was revolutionary, but it arrived too late to change the outcome of the war. Britain quickly followed with the Gloucester Meteor, which became the first Allied jet to see combat. And across the Atlantic, the U.S. entered the jet age with the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star. Cost around $200,000, $500,000 each, equal to $3 and $6 million today. Germany built the first operational jet, but Britain and the U.S. immediately joined, making jet warfare a permanent reality. And as the world split into East and West, the Cold War fueled the next stage of the arms race. Second generation, speed as a weapon, 1950s, 1960s. The Korean War proved one thing: jet combat was here to stay. The Soviet Union shocked the West with the MiG-15, which tore through U.S. bombers. But the Americans had an answer, the F-86 Sabre, which turned the skies of Korea into a deadly duel. By the late 1950s, the Soviets created the MiG-21, a supersonic beast that became the most produced jet fighter in history. It was cheap, deadly, and spread to dozens of countries. The U.S. countered with high-performance jets like the F-104 Starfighter, which earned the nickname the missile with a man in it. MiG-21 price, around $2.3 million in its prime. The Soviet Union pioneered this generation, and the MiG-21's global reach ensured Soviet dominance in numbers. But soon, air forces wanted jets that could do more than just fly fast. They wanted versatility. Third generation, the multi-role revolution, 1960s, 1970s. The U.S. took the lead here with the F-4 Phantom II, a jet that could intercept, bomb, and fight in air-to-air combat. It became a Cold War icon and served in Vietnam. The Soviets responded with the MiG-23, introducing swing wings for versatility. Meanwhile, Britain stunned the world with the Harrier jump jet, the first fighter capable of vertical takeoff and landing. Suddenly, jets didn't even need a runway. Price, $5, $10 million each. The U.S. built the first true multi-role jet, but Britain's Harrier added a level of flexibility no one had imagined before. Still, the Cold War wasn't slowing down. The next generation would push maneuverability to insane new heights. Fourth generation, the dogfight reimagined, 1970s, 1990s. This was the golden age of jet fighters. The U.S. set the standard with the F-14 Tomcat, F-15 Eagle, and F-16 Fighting Falcon. Each was powerful in its own role: air superiority, strike missions, and multi-role flexibility. The Soviet Union answered with the Su-27 Flanker, a masterpiece of agility that could pull off maneuvers Western pilots thought were impossible. Prices: F-16, $20 million, F-15, $30 million price here. The U.S. built the first fourth-gen jets, but the USSR matched them with agility and raw power. But designers weren't finished. They began upgrading radars, cockpits, and engines, leading to an in-between era. Generation, the hybrids, 1990s, 2000s. Europe took center stage with jets like the Dassault Rafale, France, and the Eurofighter Typhoon, UK, Germany, Italy, Spain. These fighters blended 4th-gen agility with 5th-gen electronics, advanced radars, powerful engines, and digital cockpits. Russia upgraded its flanker design into the Su-35, while Sweden built the Gripen E, a jet small but packed with advanced tech. Cost $120 million each. For the first time, Europe, not just the US or USSR, led a fighter generation. But the dream of invisibility was about to change everything. 5th generation, Ghosts in the Sky, 2000s present. The United States once again took the lead. The F-22 Raptor was the first true 5th-gen fighter, stealthy, super maneuverable, and digitally advanced. But it was too expensive, costing $150 million per jet, and only 187 were built. Then came the F-35 Lightning II, built for global allies, priced at $110 million. China answered with the J-20 Mighty Dragon, a long-range stealth interceptor, and later the J-35 for aircraft carriers. Russia introduced the Su-57, though only a handful are in service. Prices: F-22, $150 million, F-35, $110 million, J-20, Su-57, $120 million. The U.S. built the first 5th-gen jet, but China and Russia are racing to close the gap. And now, 6th-generation projects promise to rewrite the rules of air combat. 6th generation, the future is unmanned? 2020's future. The U.S. is developing NGAD, Next Generation Air Dominance, designed to dominate over the Pacific. Europe is building FCAS and GCAP, while China is secretly working on the J-50. These jets will feature swarm drones, artificial intelligence, and possibly optional unmanned capability. Estimated price $250–300 million per aircraft, making them the most expensive in history. The US and Europe are leading, but China is racing hard to catch up. The question is, will pilots still have a role in this future? Or will machines take over the skies completely? The cost of air supremacy. From Germany's Me-262 to America's F-22. From the Soviet MiGs to China's J-20, every generation of fighter jets tells a story of rivalry, ambition, and fear. But each leap forward also made wars deadlier and more expensive. The 6th generation may be the most advanced yet, but it might also be the last where humans are inside the cockpit. If you enjoyed this journey through the history of jet fighters, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who love military technology. Because the race for air dominance isn't ending, it's only becoming more dangerous.